The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me apologize for our late start, but such was traffic. My name is Andrew Grahn, the Assistant Director of the Center for International Studies, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's conversation between Masha Gessen and Bernardine Dohrn on Ms. Gessen's acclaimed book, Words Will Break Cement, The Passion of Pussy Riot. Before turning to introduce Masha and Bernardine, allow me to mention that today's talk is part of the Center for International Studies World Beyond the Headlines series, with generous co-sponsorship from the Human Rights Program, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies, and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. World Beyond the Headlines features acclaimed journalists, scholars, and newsmakers offering in-depth perspectives on matters of public concern. Coming up next in the series will be an author night with Alan Weissman on his new book, Countdown, Our Last Best Hope for a Future on Earth, which examines the challenge that population growth poses to sustainable living. For more information, please visit our website, cis.uchicago.edu. Tonight, however, we gather to listen to and engage with Masha Gessen and Bernardine Dohrn as they discuss Pussy Riot, Russian politics, activism, and surely much more. Masha Gessen is a journalist and author of several books, including Blood Matters, A Journey Along the Genetic Frontier, and The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. She has also co-edited Gay Propaganda, Russian Love Stories, and her writing appears regularly in Slate, The New Republic, and The New York Times, and other publications. Her latest book, which we will be discussing today, is, of course, Words Will Break Cement, The Passion of Pussy Riot. Having read and thoroughly enjoyed the book, I can say that it is a compelling, beautifully written account of the genesis, the energies, and the struggles that motivated and motivate the women, the utterly courageous and daring women, I should add, who comprise Pussy Riot. But in addition, it is a stunning portrayal of the activist spirit and an incisive critical perspective on the current state of Russian politics. Here to discuss the book is Bernardine Dohrn, the founding director of the Children and Family Justice Center and retired clinical associate professor at the Northwestern University School of Law. Earlier this year, she served as a visiting lecturer in the University of Chicago Human Rights Program. Titles aside, however, Bernardine is recognized as one of the most important political and activist voices in recent times, and I cannot thank her enough for agreeing to join us today. The structure of the evening will be as follows. Masha will begin with a short introduction to her book. Bernardine will then begin the discussion, which ultimately will be followed by an open question and answer period. We will have two microphones, one on each side of the lecture hall during the Q&A, and we do ask that you ask your questions into the microphone so that everyone can hear them and so that they will be recorded. Once the discussion is completed, Masha will be available to sign copies of her books being sold just outside the lecture hall by our partners from the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. And now, without further ado, join me in welcoming Masha Gessen and Bernardine Dohrn.
My mic on?
Can you hear? Can everybody hear?
Oh, okay. I can't hear myself, but that's nice. So thank you for that lovely introduction. And Bernardine, thank you. It's an honor to be interviewed by you.
It's my honor.
To give a short introduction to the book, I'll actually start by saying a couple words about the book I wrote before that, which was a book called The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin, which came out in March 2012. And I finished writing it at the end of 2011. I finished the epilogue at the end of 2011, which was spectacularly fast by publishing standards and taught me an important lesson of never putting in an epilogue that was just written because it was very much at odds with the rest of the book. It was incredibly optimistic because the protest movement was in full swing. It really felt like change was inevitable. And for months after that book came out, actually for months after I finished writing it, I persisted in believing that my next book would be on the decline and fall of Vladimir Putin. And I kept taking notes and sort of saving string, and then I finally realized by the fall of 2012 that what I was saving string on was the crackdown that had followed the protests, and that had begun with Putin's so-called election to a third term as president. And the other thing that happened on the day that he declared his re-election by the stunning margin of 63%, running against a ballot that was stacked with hand-picked opponents, none of whom campaigned, on that same day, 3 women were arrested. In fact, they were booked as the polls were opening in Moscow. And those were the women who had gone into the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, the biggest, most gaudy cathedral in Moscow, and spent 40 seconds there lip-singing and playing air guitar. And for that, they were arrested, charged with felony hooliganism. And in August, they were tried and sentenced to 2 years in prison. And that is, I think, an exemplary story of the crackdown. The crackdown began with them. It's almost impossible to believe now that 2 years ago people weren't actually getting arrested and going to prison for peaceful protest. Pussy Riot were the first. And now we've sort of come to think that this is almost normal for Russia, right? For people to be getting actual jail time for peaceful protest. I also thought that what they had created was a great work of art. And that's what made the book so interesting to write. And by a great work of art, which I think may surprise some people here, the fact that I'm calling that the protest that, by a great work of art, I mean 2 things. One is it has to be something that challenges and makes people re-examine their assumptions and perhaps even change their minds. And that's something that happened. And I can talk a little more about how it happened and who it happened for. And the other thing that a great work of art does is it creates concepts and images that help us understand reality. And that's very much what Pussy Riot did. And in fact, after they came out of prison 2 years later, they immediately staged another action that did the same thing, sort of proving that they that this was not an accident. And the action I'm referring to is their action in Sochi, which some of you may have seen, which is Pussy Riot starting to perform in front of a huge billboard with the official Sochi logo during the Olympics, and being attacked and horsewhipped by people in Cossack uniforms, which is the kind of violence that's taking place in Russia constantly. I've seen this happen before. In fact, I've been subjected to this violence by the Cossacks before. And it's always the Cossacks, and it's always for the cameras, and it's always with impunity. And it was Pussy Riot who managed to expose it in all its horror and glory. And the work of art that the book is about is the work of art that began when they entered the cathedral and started singing a song that had 2 refrains. One refrain was "Mother of God, chase Putin out," and the other one was "Holy shit, holy shit, holy shit," which is what has led much of the television watching Russian audience to believe that they went into a church and defecated, and because that's pretty much what Russian television has been telling them for the last 2 years. And this work of art ended, this performance ended with the end of the trial. The trial lasted for 9 days. It's a large chunk of the book is devoted to the trial. This is actually when I was writing the trial part, where there wasn't much writing involved. Most of it is the transcript. It was editing, but when I was it was when I was doing the trial part that I realized that it wasn't going to be a small book. It was actually going to be a regular-sized book. Up until then, it was supposed to be a thin, fast paperback. But in the book, in addition to the description of the protest and the trial, the book contains their personal stories, sort of leading up to how they became activists, and the stories of their actual imprisonment that followed. But I still think the heart of it is the trial, and the trial can only be described as a witch trial. Right? They were charged with felony hooliganism, felony hooliganism in Russia is defined as a crude disruption of the social order that either involves the use of violence or is motivated by hatred for a particular social group. So they were essentially charged with a hate crime, convicted of a hate crime against Orthodox believers. This was especially egregious because they were punks. They don't have a hateful bone in their bodies, and it was extremely painful for them to be accused of harboring hate. And the way in which they were accused was also painful because there was a parade of witnesses. First, there was a parade of victims. Because this crime has victims, and the victims testified that they had been deeply traumatized by either witnessing the performance or watching it on YouTube over and over again, and this had rendered them unable to work. There was testimony as to the way they crossed themselves in the cathedral. So the judge, who did most of the interrogating, because the prosecutors were kind of useless, as were the defense attorneys. So the judge asks the witness, and how did they cross themselves, like regular believers do? And the witness says, no, they did it really fast. In another instance, the prosecutor asks a witness to address the issue of whether the women are possessed. And the judge says, I'm not going to allow that, because the witness does not have a medical degree and is not qualified to render a diagnosis of possession. This is happening in the largest city in Europe in August 2012. It is hilariously funny. It's also incredibly scary. And I think it's incredibly scary, especially now that Russia is waging a culture war against the rest of the world, or certainly against the Western world. And that's very much what the trial demonstrated. It demonstrated the resolve with which Russia is taking itself back into the Middle Ages. And at the end of the trial, the three closing statements, which are included in the book in their entirety, the three closing statements by the three women, all of them very different, but all of them very pointed, very political, very articulate, and very clear on what the world has just witnessed and what they were actually doing in the cathedral, were incredibly illuminating, and they also were the finishing touch to this work of art, which did change a lot of people's minds, the minds of those people who had seen these women, or who had seen the performance on YouTube, and thought that it was sacrilegious, that it was blasphemous, and then realized what a powerful political statement it was once the performance was over in August. And I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Let me just ask for 1 second how many of you have read the book? Okay, so we're enticing you. I'm going to go a little bit into more detail, asking you things, because a lot of it was new information for me. Can I call you Masha? Is that okay?
Please do.
Okay. I have a vivid memory of my teenage years and I can remember the exact moment when I was babysitting across the street from my house, my parents' house, where I saw Elvis Presley on TV. Okay, I don't want to say it changed my life, but it was a flash of lightning into my life. When did you first hear about or see a video of Pussy Riot?
It was February 21st. Actually, I can't answer that question, but I can answer the question.
Underline that question.
Yes.
Okay.
It's February 21st, 2012, and this was one of the, well, it was probably the most exciting day in my life, actually, because it was a wonderful time. It was, as I mentioned, the protests were at their height. It really felt like change was in the air. I was very much involved in the protests. When the protests broke out in December 2011, I had started help organize, and very quickly I became the point person for most of the actual street level organization of the direct action. I ran a weekly clearinghouse of direct action, so people would come in and and propose various actions. And often it would last for hours, and it took place in a cafe in Moscow. And then we would, some of the other organizers and I would stay there drinking afterwards, which is relevant because this was on Monday nights. And so on Monday nights I would get home very late and not necessarily sober. And February 21st, 2012 was a Tuesday, and my girlfriend woke me up at 6 in the morning, and she said, "I think my water just broke." So I had to drive her to the hospital, not having quite sobered up, so I was there,
Great.
waiting for our son to be born. And actually, this was the first time that I was in that position. I'd had a baby before, but I'd never been the partner at the birth. It really takes a long time, and
and your assignment isn't clear.
right, and your assignment isn't clear. So I was trying to be entertaining and informative, and I was checking my messages all the time and looking at the news wires, and I was trying to work a little bit, and around noon, there was an item on the news wires that said Pussy Riot has staged a protest in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior.
Ah.
So I was like, hey, Pussy Riot has staged a protest at the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. I got no reaction, but I thought it was terribly exciting. And I've actually gone back to that moment and thought it was terribly exciting and wondered why I thought it was terribly exciting. Because why were they on my radar? They had only existed for 4 months at that point. They had staged, really this was their 5th action. I mean, so that was fortunate for me as a sort of biographer. I was actually able to describe each action in detail in the book, which was great fun to do, and I think makes for some interesting reading. But I was really trying to figure out what it was that had put them on my mental map before this amazing action on February 21st, 2012. And I don't have an answer, but I think there was something about their being incredibly well attuned to the timing and the tensions of the period, and actually being way ahead of the curve.
Okay, I'm gonna come back around to some of those actions, but one of the other things you say at the beginning, early on in the book, is you say you're talking about Nadia, and you say to create and to confront. Interesting. Not always the same. One has to be an outcast. So I had some experience a long time ago with being an outlaw, and I, often have mused about the fact that there's a strange sense of romance and I don't know what, and intrigue in American life about the outlaw. And I'm wondering how outlaw and outcast play here, and what you meant by one has to be an outcast.
What I actually meant was that, I think most societies consist mostly of people who conform. Authoritarian societies have to consist vastly of people who conform. It is very unsafe not to conform. It is not, what you risk is not just not belonging, what you risk is often your life. So it's a place of extreme discomfort. And I think you can only confront from a place of discomfort. I don't necessarily think that you can only create from a place of discomfort, but I suspect that's also true.
I think it might be too. So one other thing that you say early on is you say something that's kind of well known in Chicago and south side of Chicago life. You say art hurts. Do many of you know that there's a very famous poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, who was the poet laureate of Illinois, now gone, where she says, "Art hurts, art urges voyages." So it's a little bit of the same question, but I'm wondering why you begin with that notion of art. It maybe is the same as the outcast or the other side of it, or what you're trying to elicit in the population.
Yeah, I wonder if there are any Russians in the audience. Yes. I think you will probably confirm that the Pussy Riot makes people extremely uncomfortable. Not you.
Not you.
but often, people come up to me after talks or write to me after reading the book, and they start by saying how uncomfortable Pussy Riot makes them, and how their first reaction to Pussy Riot's action is negative, and how everything else is perhaps about coming around to a sort of understanding. I don't think that that's necessarily the way we're taught to think about art. I think the kind of art that you were taught as a child, especially again as a child growing up in the Soviet Union, which is where the only art that was considered palatable had to be palatable. Right? It was socialist realism. It had to affirm a kind of idealized reality, and it had to make you very comfortable. So the notion that art makes you uncomfortable is actually strange to the audience that Pussy Riot was addressing.
So who were they addressing?
Well, I'm glad you asked that.
I mean, but who did they think they were addressing? I mean, I know they're performance artists. Well, that doesn't even sum it up. They did many things over the course of this short, quick life of actions, as I understand it from your book. So for whom?
I think that's something that they've actually thought about since the action quite a lot, and they've I think Nadia, who was sort of the mastermind behind the formation of the group Pussy Riot. And actually, I should backtrack for a second and say Pussy Riot is not a punk rock group. Pussy Riot is a fictional character that is enacted by an art collective called Pussy Riot. Right, so Pussy Riot is a fictional punk rock group that is played by these women, so Nadia was very much behind the invention of Pussy Riot, and Nadia was very much the mastermind of the Cathedral action. And I think what has caused her quite a lot of pain was realizing that she didn't think that much about who the audience was. Her frame of reference lay within a small segment of Moscow society, which was largely its artists and its art critics. So primarily she was talking to them. They were also talking to a large extent to the protest culture. And it's actually accurate to call it protest culture rather than protest movement, because it didn't have the sort of coordinating mechanisms that a movement usually has. It had a sort of spontaneity that a culture can have, and part of what they were talking about was pushing the limits of protest. The protest in Russia that was happening at the time was very much was legal protest, and legal in Russia means very many bizarre things, like getting a permit ahead of time and only going to a cordoned off space and never venturing outside the cordoned off space, and basically only talking to yourself. And never talking to anybody.
We've become familiar with that, I have to say.
Right. Not quite.
I know. I'm not saying it's the same,
but yes,
those who were here during the NATO demonstrations will remember how cordoned off and under siege we were.
Right. So. So part of what they were saying was addressing the protest culture and saying the protest has to confront, the protest has to be outside of the boundaries that have been set for us. Otherwise, it's not protest.
Right. So you describe a great long beginning, which is your drive. Are you in the car at that moment? You seem to be in the car to visit Nadia by her husband and her child. Mm-hmm. Child is 4 years old, and you're visiting penal colony number 14 or IK 14, 2-day drive, restricted territory, giant penal colony surrounded by gray walls, visitors entrance with rules all over the walls and a lot of delay and waiting, but you keep this Dara, the 4-year-old, in the picture the whole time, I think in a very fascinating way, including her coming out after the visit. I'm assuming you didn't go into the visit.
Right, I didn't go that time.
Right, so they go in, and and then you see her, and then you're back in the car doing the long ride back. So maybe, I found that totally fascinating. Partly, I have a child whose parents were in prison. for 20 years. We did a lot of prison visits here. Again, I don't want to compare it exactly. I'm just resonating about certain themes in this. Maybe you just tell us a little bit about being in that car and going to visit.
Right. Thank you.
With a child.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comparison is actually perfectly valid. I mean, we can't really compare the conditions in U.S. prisons and Russian prisons, but certainly unfreedom, is a quality that's that's the same for everybody. And part of what I was actually trying to describe was the unfreedom that everybody in the car was experiencing. I'm glad. Actually, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned it. I'm also glad you're focusing on Gera, because everyone else who's asked me about this, the prologue, has asked me about the father. Naja's father, whom you've omitted altogether. He's an incredibly unlikable character, but also compelling and very important to Naja's story. And he's also kind of central to that whole horrible drive. We were going there. The reason that I kept both of them in the picture was because I felt like they were both reacting to that to that experience of unfreedom. The child is separated from her mother. It's which is just horrifying to me.
It's horrifying. And then visiting and leaving.
Right, visiting and leaving, but also what I found heartbreaking was going there, and Gera, she was amazing. I mean, it took us like 14 hours to get there, so 14-hour basically uninterrupted drive, and a 4-year-old kid makes it without throwing tantrums, just asking every half an hour whether we're there yet, and asking to pee every 10 minutes. But other than that, she was great, and it was all because she was so motivated to see her mother. And everybody was really on their best behavior on the way in the car. And Andrei, the father, the girl's grandfather, was entertaining her the whole time. And then they were supposed to have a 4-hour visit, and the visits were 4 hours every 2 months. And a conjugal 3-day visit every 3 months. So, and Gera, the child, could go on both. And she usually did. But that's it. That's how often she got to see her mom. So at this point, she hadn't seen her mother in 2 months, which is pretty much an eternity at the age of 4. And she's looking forward to seeing her. And then she goes and she gets 4 hours, and she doesn't get the 4 hours. Because first we're in the waiting house, and it takes too long to process the papers. So they steal an hour at the front end, and then they steal another half hour by searching them. And then they steal another half hour at the end because they want to go home. And so, so they only get really 2 hours out of their 4 hours. And they don't get anything out of it. And on the way back in the car, Gera started throwing a tantrum and saying, I want to go back to my grandmother, I want to go back to the hotel, I want to go back to sleep, I don't want to be in the car. And Andrei, the 6-year-old grandfather, also started throwing a tantrum and screaming at his son-in-law that Gera is a bad child. And at that point, it was just so painful to witness all these people, this young person and this grown person lashing out in pain at not being where they want to be, not being with who they want to be with, being with people they don't want to be with, in the stupid car in the middle of Mordovia, with me driving them for some reason. And that's sort of the story.
Yeah. So I didn't realize you'd actually gone into a visit, but the gist of your book is through written correspondence with them, with you using a pseudonym, and going through censored prison correspondence.
Right.
And yet you you conjure them up in a very textured and vivid, emotive way as a writer. And I'm wondering what your writing tricks are, or how you, really how you thought about giving it a portraiture that is alive, that has that kind of detail that doesn't come from text.
Well, I thought it was easy because in my previous 2 books,
Right.
The book that I'd written before that was a book about Putin, whom I didn't actually get to meet in person until after I'd written the book. So it was all based on studying his interviews, studying his every videotape that he'd ever been on, studying all the interviews. I find it very productive. I actually find it in some ways more productive than having access to the person. Especially when you talk to the people who know the person. Because my book before that was a book about the Russian mathematician Grigory Perelman, who proved the Poincare conjecture. He's the guy that most of you have probably heard about. He proved the Poincare conjecture, and then he turned down the $1 million prize, and then he didn't talk to anybody. And so that whole book was based on talking to everybody who'd ever worked with him, studied with him, talked with him, etc. And that was my first experience of reporting a piece like that, which I actually found incredibly rewarding, because there were all these people who wanted to tell me what they saw and how they experienced a person, and I didn't actually have the person's own narrative to be beholden to. So I was basing my portrait on the experiences of people who were near that person, which is kind of how we experience other people. You don't experience them through their own view of themselves.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So this book was really easy to write, because not only did I have access to all the people who'd studied with them, and the families were wonderful. I mean, everybody talked to me, including people who knew they weren't going to be portrayed in a flattering way, which is true of both of the fathers who figure in the book. The husbands, the boyfriends, the friends. Masha Alyokhina, who was one of the two women who served the 2 years, she was unbelievably generous. She allowed me to have letters that she'd written to family and friends, which are so intimate, and some of these letters are in the book, and they're much more intimate than anything she would have written to a journalist. I mean, it was amazing to be given that, and they're not just the letters; they're also drawings that she'd sent. She'd drawn her cell and sent the drawings to her closest friend. But yes, the correspondence with Nadia was the most bizarre aspect of the whole process, because Nadia, through her lawyer, I had asked the question of whether she would cooperate on the book, and she sent me a very detailed letter that was smuggled out of prison, and that's difficult. So we couldn't have reported the book through smuggled letters, but occasionally we had smuggled notes. So she smuggled this one note out, and it had instructions. It said, do not give any indication in our correspondence that you're publishing something. Do not ask me questions about anything that can be used against me, like in the criminal case, or in my attempts to get parole. And if you are comfortable with it, please use a pseudonym. For example, Martha Rossler. Martha Rossler is an American contemporary artist. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll use Martha Rossler. So I wrote her a letter, and I realized this was not going to work, because I'm not Martha Rossler, and I don't feel like Martha Rossler. And I thought, well, maybe I could be like someone else, because Martha Rossler isn't in no way like me. I mean, I'm not an artist, and I'm not American. If I have to be an American somebody, or maybe I could be like Judith Butler, because at least she's Jewish and lesbian, and I kind of feel like maybe I'll look like her in 20 years. But then I was talking to Peter, Nadia's husband, and I realized that Judith Butler is a deity to them, and I can't be Judith Butler, because that would be like taking too high a level. So I stayed Martha Rossler, because I couldn't figure out who else to be.
So I'm going to jump to asking you, if you don't mind, to describe for this audience one or two of the actions that happened, maybe even once they became Pussy Riot, or even before, when they were part of the Voina collective, art collective.
Right.
Maybe I'll just tell the audience kind of the names of the performances. It'll remind you of which one you want to talk about. Fuck for the Air Puppy Bear. That's Puppy Bear is Medvedev. The humiliation of a cop in his home, a cop in a priest's casa, memory of the Decembrists, storming of the White House, and fuck the FSB. Just for some, or Bust the Buzz, another one, the first all-women's one.
Yeah, actually, I think I'll let me describe the fuck for the air teddy bear action, which actually has been used against Nadia a lot, and this was an action that in some ways was key to what later became Pussy Riot. So this was on the eve of the presidential election in March 2008. And this was an art collective called Vayna, which means war, which was founded by Petya and Nadia, who were a very young married couple, and another married couple named Oleg and Natalia, who were a little bit older. 3 of the 4 had been students at the philosophy department of Moscow University. So they knew way too much to create clear and concise art.
In fact, I have to say my most surprising thing was how intellectual these women are. I mean, they are heady and verbal, and yeah.
Yeah, they're fascinating. So there was another thing that made them so much more fun than Putin.
Exactly.
The action involved. The title refers to the election of Medvedev. Medvedev's last name means bear in Russian, and he kind of looks like a cross between a teddy bear and a third grader, and he had been anointed Putin's heir. So that's the title, Fuck for the Air Teddy Bear. So what they did is they went into the zoology museum in Moscow, Zoology for the Bear, and they fucked. They disrobed. There were, I think, 4 couples, and Nadia was 9 months pregnant. And she and Petya copulated, and as did everybody else, in pairs. And the message of
heterosexual pairs.
And heterosexual pairs. The message of the action, which I learned only when I started reporting the book. I mean, I'd known of the action, but I didn't understand what the point was, except to be reverent. The message of the action is brilliant. The message of the action is that Russian elections are to politics what pornography is to love and sex. What pornography is to sex. So it's a poor commercialized copy of the real thing.
Right.
Which, if they had only released that with a clear statement, but what they always did was they would...
It's art! You can't explain it.
They would release it, but they obscured it. I mean, that was the problem.
Yes.
They would layer all these symbols on top of what they had already done, to the point where most people didn't really get it. Pussy Riot, when they were founded, they set out to be the opposite. They wanted to have their art be very accessible. So, as with Vayna, their final product was a video clip. But the video clip always had to be posted with a very clear explication of what the action was and why they were doing what they were doing.
So, you say that when they became all women and when they jumped out here, they were there. The words you used I thought were so interesting. They concealed their art with fun and mischief, you say, right? And as feminists, that was a strategy. And then you talk about some of the American and Canadian inspirations for them, perhaps Guerrilla Girls, Bikini Kill, Kathleen Hanna, Riot Girl Culture, maybe Sleater Kinney, and so on. So maybe I'd just be interested in how much it was influenced, how much it was coming from just out of their own experience, trying to clear their way to where they were going, and that I'm so interested in the fun and mischief part, because...
Well, I think it was a bit of both. So the story of how Pussy Riot was invented is actually that Nadia was giving a presentation at a conference of opposition activists. And she decided to do a presentation on feminist art.
Right.
And so she created this whole long lecture, very comprehensive, very smart, really like a freshman course on feminist art, sort of crammed into an hour and a half lecture. But she found it to be very politically sort of underwhelming not to have any Russian artists in the presentation. There's just one, and she's from the 90s, and she was very commercial. So Nadia decided to invent a Russian artist to place at the end of the presentation to sort of make it more, more politically correct.
Right.
And so they invented this group called Pussy Riot. And Pussy is a Russian word for a children's word for genitals. It's like wee-wee, so it's like wee-wee riot. And it was like a combination of everything. It was this amazingly versatile group that created visual art, copies of classic paintings with like a feminist reinterpretation,
Right.
and music. They created punk rock music. They did everything because I think they wanted to have a group in Russia that would do everything. And so they even recorded they did a painting by Pussy Riot, and they also recorded a song by Pussy Riot, this imaginary group, which, because neither Nadia nor Katya, who she was working with at the time, was a musician, that was a little difficult, but they took the music by a British punk group called the Cockney Rebels, or the Cockney Rejects, and they overlaid it with their own lyrics, which were lyrics that a punk rock feminist group in Russia would sing if it existed. And so it was like a caricature. It began with stinky socks, and it ended with this incredible line, "Envy your own fucking penis." And at the end of this presentation, Nadia said, so incredibly, there's a punk rock art collective, women's art collective, working in Nizhny Novgorod right now as we speak, and we're going to leave you with a song by them. And then so she pressed the button on the boombox, and she and Katya got up and left the room. And the operator left, I watched this on video, I wasn't actually there, the operator left the room following them. So you could see the faces of the people in the audience, which was about 40 men, sort of sitting there thinking, what are they supposed to do? Because this sounded awful. And it sounded like 1,000 rusty nails against a blackboard. And like, were they allowed to get up and turn this off and leave the room? Or were Nadia and Katya coming back? What was happening? So that was the start. So the influences were written into the legend of this character.
Right, because it was a history of feminist art, yeah.
It absolutely had to be influenced by feminist art, and it had to be a punk rock group, since that's what they made up. Then they decided to make it reality. As for fun and mischief, I think, and I talk about it quite a lot in the book, that they were in a very difficult position of trying to find words in a country that had completely devalued words, that had corrupted its language and then corrupted it again. Mm-hmm. And so they had to find ways of saying things that would be heard, and I think they found a very effective way.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you one other question, even though I'm being told it's time, because I just want to get back to two things. One is the way that the story you tell interweaves with gay activists and with the current. I don't know, it's not just current, but the accelerated crackdown on gay and lesbian life there. So that's one piece of it, because as this is unfolding, there's an arrest of 3 gay activists in Red Square, and then they do an action in Red Square. And then maybe a little pondering about the cathedral itself, and the meaning of the cathedral, or the multiple meanings of the cathedral, as it relates to Putin.
Right. Well, let me try to do that fast. So I'll do the anti-gay thing fast, because that's really easy. And they were brilliant. They included gay rights in their songs. At a time when most of us did not realize this was going to become the major political issue in Russia, mm-hmm. Which it has, and I'm kind of ashamed. For years, for probably 2 decades, I was actually the most sort of visible lesbian in Russia, and I wasn't paying attention. I didn't realize this was becoming a thing, that I was the enemy. I mean, me personally. I was going to become enemy number one. They got it very early because they were really paying attention to the culture war that Putin was unleashing. So that's pretty amazing. And that, of course, is part of the reason that they went into the cathedral. The cathedral symbolizes a lot of stuff. It symbolizes the symbiosis of church and state in Russia. At the time that they went into the cathedral, Putin, who was made very nervous by the protests, had called on the Russian Orthodox Church, as Russian dictators and Soviet dictators, in fact, have always done in times of crisis, and asked the church to campaign for him. And it was campaigning for him, and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church had compared him to God. And parish priests were telling, I mean, it's an unsubtle church, and parish priests were...
We have some of our own here, unsubtle.
Parish priests were telling parishioners not to attend protests because believers don't go to protests. The cathedral is also a symbol of corruption. Because it houses a car wash. It houses a banquet hall that's rented out. It houses an Orthodox charity whose books show money coming in but no money ever going out. It's also a symbol of corruption because it's the first large-scale example of successful extortion in contemporary Russian history. It was built on a site where a cathedral had existed 100 years earlier. It was built in the 1990s. It was built by shaking down every business in Moscow to contribute to the construction of the cathedral. So it stands there as this giant, gaudy, horrible building. You can see it from any place in central Moscow. As a monument to extortion and corruption. And one last thing, one of the actions that I describe in the book is their action called Kropotkin Vodka, which is an action against consumerism of the Putin era. And it was filmed in a series of performances in luxury boutiques and fashion shows, and they accidentally set a fashion show on fire while they were filming it, and so they had to run away. And they ran away by getting on the subway, and then they got off at Kropotkinskoye, which is a station named for Kropotkin, for whom the action was named. But it's also the station where the Cathedral of Christ the Savior sits. And the day that they got off, which was a rainy day in late November, there was a line around this enormous block. It was a line of hundreds of thousands of women who were standing there in the freezing rain, waiting to touch the Virgin's girdle. The Virgin's girdle is a relic that usually resides in a monastery in Greece and was touring Russia, and 1 million people availed themselves of the opportunity to touch the Virgin's girdle while it was touring Russia because it cures infertility and everything else. And so it was sort of the artistic challenge that they were facing was trying to show the absurdity of the city, which houses, the biggest Bentley dealership in the world, and the Virgin's girdle with a line of women standing there, hundreds of thousands of women standing there waiting to touch it, and that's what they succeeded in doing in this performance, which began with the singing in the cathedral and ended with the trial.
And ended really with the trial, but also you describe their ability to continue performance art even under these terribly harsh prison conditions. So I'm urging you all to read the book. Okay, your turn. Okay.
Can I? So you meet Putin personally?
Yes, I did.
Who want to keep you as the editor, whatever. And what is your first question, personal opinion that not you? I read your book actually, but some intuitive opinion that can help us to understand when his regime will collapse.
Good.
I have sworn off making predictions, but no, and I actually don't think it's possible. It's he has created a closed system, and the system can only self-destruct. And it will self-destruct. Will it self-destruct in a year or in 20 years from now? I don't know. It's a black box, and we can't peek inside.
You don't think it's that history also pushes from the outside? You do. You're an activist.
I do. I mean, I think that there's something about the relationship
Yeah.
of pressure outside and inside
Right.
that ultimately leads to the collapse. But again, we don't know how high the pressure is on the inside.
We can't tell.
Right.
Right. Only in retrospect.
Is it? Oh,
Yes.
hi. I just want to say I really love your work. I really love your articles. They're all incredibly insightful. I was wondering if you could comment on Pussy Riot's visit to the U.S. And their interactions with American popular culture. I'm thinking specifically of their interview on the Colbert Report, which was very strange and very interesting, to me at least.
You know what? I haven't watched it. I know it's bizarre, but I'm so much not in the habit of watching video, and I was done writing about them. I keep meaning to. I've heard great things about it, but I haven't actually watched it. I have watched their interactions with popular culture in other iterations, and it's been pretty incredible. I did a short piece for Vanity Fair on them, and I went to the photo shoot, and they, in fact, I sort of helped negotiate the photo shoot, and they, at first they said, when they were negotiating the wardrobe, they said, please no tight tops for Nadia and no tight bottoms for Masha. And so they get to the photo shoot, and you know, these clothes are ridiculous. I mean, the whole production is always ridiculous. That's sort of the nature of the beast. And so we're in this, they've just flown in. We're on a rooftop in Chinatown in New York. There's like 15 people holding the lights and the cameras and whatever, and 20 people doing makeup. And Nadia comes out of the dressing room after about half an hour of makeup, wearing a tight top, with a tight sleeveless top, and she says, "I hate this. I asked them for no tight tops. I hate my upper arms, and I don't want to wear this top." And I said, "Well, you have to go back in there and tell them you don't want to wear this top because you're the star of the show. You can say whatever you want." She's like, "Really? Okay." So she went in, said, "I don't want to wear this." They came out dressed completely differently. About half an hour later, they were on the rooftop directing the shoot. They were, Nadia was saying, "Okay, I think I want a heavy chain to go with this frilly dress," and sending the assistant out to a hardware store to buy a heavy chain to go on top of this dress, and looking at the pictures as they were coming up on the screen, and getting very, very, very engaged with it. They are unbelievably adaptable, and they're such natural leaders. It's absurd. I've watched them give their first speech in English, which was kind of it was also like such a great present for a journalist, because I was hanging out with them to do this Vanity Fair piece while they were in New York for a few days, and so I went into the dressing room of the Women in the World Summit, which is this very bizarre, glamorous feminist undertaking that Tina Brown organizes, and there they were trying to organize, trying to memorize their speech in English, which they'd written in Russian, was translated for them, and so they're memorizing it. And Masha called me over and said, "How do you pronounce this word?" "You pronounce it endure." And she was like, "Endure, endure, endure." I was like, I can't believe she just gave me this gift of asking me how to pronounce the word endure.
Her essence.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they.
They're photographed on the web. I just looked this afternoon with Paul McCartney last night in L.A. I mean,
no, that's an old photo. Actually,
is it an old photo?
They were with Paul McCartney last month.
I found it today.
Last night they were in D.C. The night before they were at the Penn Gala in New York.
Right, and the Amnesty Gala and so on. So they met with the U.S. ambassador to the UN. They're having they have access, and they're really trying hard to use that access as well as they can, and it's remarkable what they did yesterday in D.C. In a meeting with senators and congressmen. They said, we have 3 issues that we want to bring up.
One is the Bolotny prisoners, which are people in Russia who have gone to jail for a protest a legal protest that ended in violence because of a police provocation. Two is we want to talk about the new restrictions, the violation of police rights, of the human rights of policemen in Russia, because they've now been banned from leaving the country, which is very interesting, that they're trying to sort of send a message back to Russia, that they're also standing up for the human rights of police who have abused them. And three, we want to talk about the trial of the Occupy Wall Street protester.
Right.
And
you all know that the first person went to prison.
Right.
Yeah, just went to prison.
So, you know, they're good.
They're good. No, there's no question about it. Oh, yeah.
Okay, I think I... Is this on? Okay. I think it's enough. There's like... there were 4 people. Now it's mostly 2, like publicly.
No, there were 3 people
Like,
who were sentenced.
The performance.
There were 5 people at the performance.
5.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So mostly we know about like Nadia and Masha. Oh,
Mm-hmm. Nadia and Masha, yes.
yeah. We are the other 3.
Right. Well, Pussy Riot is by definition an anonymous membership. It's an open membership collective and an anonymous collective. So people who speak on behalf of Pussy Riot speak under pseudonyms and while wearing balaclavas. As one member told me, it's like being Spider-Man. You put on the balaclava, you're Pussy Riot. You take off the balaclava, you're no longer Pussy Riot. So there are actually a number of Pussy Riot participants in the book, some of whom are identified as Pussy Riot participants, some of whom are identified by their real names and therefore are not identified as Pussy Riot participants. But as for and there are a lot more than 5 people in the book, because there are a lot of people who took part in the actions along the way. Of the 5 people who were at the Cathedral, 2 were able to avoid prosecution, so they were never unmasked. The experience of trying to interview them is the only really unpleasant experience that I had in reporting of the book, which was they tried to shake me down, and in a just a very ugly way. So I refused to talk to them, and because I don't pay for interviews. And Katya, who was the 3rd person who was unmasked, and who stood trial and was sentenced, then broke ranks and was released on a technicality, but was basically given a suspended sentence. She is in the book. I tried to be as gentle as possible and non-judgmental about her actions. I think I actually am probably more successful than I wanted to be in doing that.
I thought you did a perfect job. I mean, you've described the 2 who go to prison's lives, you know, harsh lives for 2-year sentences. They go on hunger strikes, they're hospitalized, they disappear for weeks into the gulag. And so, but I think you also, you know, people measure sometimes what they can do, and
right,
and she opted out, you know, of that.
She opted out. She opted out under incredible emotional strain.
Right.
And I really don't judge her for that. What I do judge her for is what she's done since their release, which is she's denounced. And that's not in the book. But she's denounced them. She said, they're no longer Pussy Riot, I'm Pussy Riot. She actually tried to prevent the publication of the book, and by lying that I'd never talked to her. And I have like 12 hours of recorded interviews with her. But the most recent thing she did, which really has actually, this was like 2 days ago, and I've decided I'm not going to be nice about this anymore. They are getting an award from the Human Rights Foundation. Yeah, it's the Human Rights Foundation. In Oslo next week, Nadia and Masha are getting the Václav Havel Power to Speak Award.
Great.
And she wrote a letter to the organizer saying they're not Pussy Riot, they shouldn't be getting the award. It's like, you know, they went to prison for 2 years.
Yes,
they get to do anything they want with the name Pussy Riot for as long as they live. So,
I agree.
Yeah.
Masha, Thank you very much. My name is Dasha. Most of my academic work is on Pussy Riot.
Wow.
And I'm particularly interested in Russian performance art, and I've been following the situation very closely, both in Moscow and abroad. So my question to you is in particularly because I think that you also speak to two different audiences, and there were a lot of issues in translation that I'm sure you know about between how Pussy Riot is spoken about and received, but also what social context it folds into. So while, for example, Pussy Riot work with an obvious visual inheritance that they explicitly speak of, Guerrilla Girls and so on, punk is very important. However, it ultimately kind of morphs into one kind of social body in the United States, in particular, or Western world, where, for example, things like anti-religion and anti-church are often one and the same thing, and things like blasphemy do not really have a very articulated role. Whereas in Russia, for example, I mean, I'm not even mentioning the fact that Bolotnaya Square was totally ignored from the translation threshold. But other than that, for example, Nadia frequently identifies herself with Christ and also speaks for the performance art as Christ as the ultimate kind of punk model. And also other just references that never really make it through translation, in particular religious ones. In the trial itself also, they frequently made references to the trial of Christ. And I'm wondering what you make of that, or whether you think this is at all even relevant, or simply it's relevant to Russia and its Russian Orthodox issues of radicalism within Russian Orthodoxy, and whether that's just irrelevant outside of that.
Right. You know, oddly, I actually didn't have to deal with that particular issue in the book because Nadia didn't actually start reading the Bible until she landed in jail. So all of this talk about comparing themselves to Christ and talking about Christ as the ultimate punk performer, this actually has come out since she was released, and the book ends before they're released. What I actually found in writing the book was the exact opposite. And it was one of the reasons I wanted to write about it, was that actually in August 2012, on the day of the sentencing, I happened to be in New York. I'd been reporting on the trial in Moscow, and then I flew to New York. And in New York, there was a reading at the Ace Hotel, where they stayed 2 years later. But at the Ace Hotel, it was like this huge reading. There was a line around the block. 300 people didn't get in. And all these contemporary artists from New York were reading their words, which was kind of amazing. I mean, I'm sure all these people had not thought about Russia possibly ever, certainly not in decades. So it was people like Karen Finley and Justin Bond and Eileen Miles. And as I listened to, I think, Karen Finley read Nadia's closing statement in court, I thought, wow, this sounds so much better in English than it does in Russian. In Russian, it sounded like it had been translated from English. But in English, it sounds perfectly natural. It sounds like the speech of a 23-year-old who's seeped in the Western protest culture, who's probably at Occupy Wall Street, who is articulating her position.
Yeah, right.
And in Russian, it was almost incomprehensible to most of the people who had the opportunity to read it or listen to it.
And why is that?
Because none of that stuff has made its way to Russia. I mean, none of the contemporary social criticism has actually entered the culture.
We have time for just.
Hi, Masha. Is it on? Just wondered if you could maybe freeform think about the anti-gay and lesbian crackdowns around the world, the global backlash against. Do you think there's any tie to them? Are they each individual? Just what your thoughts are in general.
Well, this is something that I've been writing about recently. In fact, I just wrote a new postscript to the Putin book that will probably come out in a month or so in an updated edition. That's all about the anti-gay campaign, because I think the anti-gay campaign, it is the biggest issue in Russian politics right now. And I think that's not something that people understand in this country, because I mean, for the longest time, not only I didn't notice that it was happening, but the world didn't notice that it was happening. But when the Western media finally noticed, I think the interpretation was completely wrong. The interpretation of the anti-gay campaign in this country is generally that it's Putin is trying to distract from the real issues. That he doesn't want people to think about the slowing economy and the corruption, and so he wants to have people think about how bad the gays are. That's not what's happening at all. Basically, what has happened is that it began as sort of classic scapegoating. Putin called the protesters queer because that was the ultimate insult, and it was a very good shorthand for saying that they're other, because they're sort of the ultimate foreign Asian. They're the ultimate Western import. And then he realized that he really hit rhetorical pay dirt with this. That this was this has so much traction in Russia. This is the best enemy to have, and Russia has traditionally defined itself in relationship to an enemy. And part of the problem with Russian national identity, I'm trying to summarize a 3,500 word postscript in 2 minutes. Part of the problem with Russian national identity in the last quarter century has been the lack of an enemy. After World War II, America was the enemy, and then it wasn't anymore. And so who was Russia going to feel attacked by? Who was Russia going to protect itself from? Russia is always a fortress under siege. That's how it sees itself. And now, finally, the gays, which sounds absurd, but it's not, because it actually is the chasm between the Western world and the non-Western world.
Is Ukrainian gay now?
And Ukraine is gay now. It's in December of last year, when the Duma was passing its first resolution on Ukraine, the head of the Committee on Foreign Relations in the Duma said, Ukraine doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't realize that if it goes west, the European Union is going to control its finances and use it to broaden the sphere of influence of gay culture, which is the official policy of the European Union now. And if you ask Russians who they're fighting in Ukraine, they're fighting American homosexual fascists. So this has turned Putin from a post-ideological president, which is what he was for the first 12 years, into an ideological president. And he has stopped thinking about Russia as a nation state. He started thinking of Russia as a civilization state. And the civilizational mission of Russia is to become the traditional values capital of the world. And in this, it has allies not only in the post-Soviet world, but also in Africa, but also among Arab countries, and Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan. When I wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that Russia wants to become the leader of the anti-Western world, and Pat Buchanan immediately responded, "Well, if Russia is trying to do that because of the gays, then that God is on Russia's side." So Russia is leading the Traditional Values Coalition in the UN, where it's joined not only by post-Soviet countries and Uganda and Nigeria, but also by Ecuador and Malaysia and Pakistan, and it really sees itself as the leader.
And the Vatican.
And the Vatican.
I want to urge everybody to also just check out the interview that Terry Gross does with you, because I think it takes us into this area, as well as talking about Pussy Riot, into the entire area about the new anti-gay pushback and contest.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. And chat more with Masha, but let us thank both Bernardine Dohrn and Masha Gessen for joining us.
Thank you.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.